Those interested in the history of military aviation are probably well acquainted with the Italian fighter Fiat CR32 Chiri, which became the backbone of the rebel air power during the Spanish Civil War, and also saw combat at the start of World War II. Everyone has heard of Fiat's later fighter developments, CR42, G50, G55, but the predecessors of the Cricket are much less known to the general public. In this piece, I will try to fill that gap and introduce listeners to the first fighters produced by Fiat. The Fiat company was founded in 1899 and, as the name itself suggests, was primarily focused on designing and manufacturing automobiles. The first car assembly plant was opened in 1900 in Turin. However, even before World War I and shortly after its outbreak, Fiat engineers created and built several experimental airplanes and aircraft engines. The first engine produced in 1915, the A10, had an output of about 130 horsepower, and a year later production began of the more powerful A12 engines, which accounted for more than half of all Italian aircraft power plants produced during the war years. In 1915, the Italian military proposed that the firm produce the French Farman biplane under license, so a year later Fiat opened an aircraft building branch called SIA. However, the two-seat reconnaissance aircraft developed in the branch by engineers Umberto Savoia and Pietro Verduzio had such weak tactical and technical characteristics that in June 1918, the Italian Army Command ordered all aircraft bearing the SIA designation withdrawn from combat service. From that time, these machines were used only in training units. Thus, despite the impressive number of aircraft built, a total of 501 of the first model, 71 of the second modification, and 62 of the third version, the company's debut in military aircraft development could not be considered very successful. In 1925, a group of investors owning Fiat acquired the firm Aeronautica Ansaldo, which became its aircraft division under the new name Aeronautica d'Italia. However, several years before that acquisition, the company's aviation specialists, led by Chief Engineer Celestino Rosatelli, had on their own initiative begun creating an experimental single-seat fighter. 2 prototypes were built and passed factory tests in 1923. According to the new numbering system adopted by the Italian Air Force, these 2 aircraft received factory numbers. They were relatively small biplanes, the characteristic feature of which was a lower wing with a greater span than the upper wing. Both prototypes were fitted with imported Hispano-Suiza engines rated at 400 horsepower and had wooden airframe structures with plywood and fabric skinning. The trademark of Rosatelli's fighters, beginning with these airplanes and for the next 1.5 decades, became the rigid, W-shaped struts of the biplane box of the so-called Warren type. Armament was standard for the time and consisted of a pair of Vickers rifle-caliber machine guns synchronized with the engine. The 2 prototypes differed slightly from each other in the shape of the tail unit. One had a rudder with a rounded horn balance, the other did not, and in the contours of the cowlings covering the Hispano-Suiza engines. The Italian Air Force Command liked the new fighter, and the firm received an order for series production of the airplane, which was designated CR1 after the initials of the chief designer. The version with the horn-balanced rudder was accepted as the standard for the series. A total of 240 CR1s were built and entered service. Some of them were equipped with upgraded Hispano-Suiza engines rated at 430 horsepower. The first serial fighters were delivered to operational aviation units in 1925. The export history of the fighter was not particularly rich, which is unsurprising given the saturated market for combat aircraft in the 1920s and 1930s and the wide choice of models offered by the leading European aviation powers, of which Italy, frankly, never really ranked among the top. In fact, there was only one export order for 9 aircraft from Latvia. These machines equipped a unit of marine fighters based in Liepāja. Latvian operation of the CR1 ended in 1936. One example retired from service in the Italian Air Force was purchased by, for unclear reasons that probably had little to do with strengthening its combat power, the Belgian Air Force. Another aircraft was bought and tested by Polish aviation specialists. While serial production of the CR1 was ramping up and the aircraft was entering service, Fiat engineers were trying to improve its flight characteristics. The main method was installing new, more powerful engines. One after another, new variants appeared. The CR5 with a 400 horsepower radial Alfa Romeo Jupiter. This was an Italian copy of the British Bristol engine produced in Italy since 1924. and the CR10, which first flew in 1925. The CR10 was fitted with Fiat's own 12-cylinder water-cooled A20 engine producing 410 horsepower and equipped with 2 Lamblin radiators. However, these modifications did not go into series production because a promising new fighter by Rosatelli, the Fiat CR20, was already in development. More on that below. The firm attempted to convert the 10 into a float-plane fighter designated CR10 Hydro, but this also proved unsuccessful. In 1928, the CR2 was built and tested, equipped with the radial Alfa Romeo Lynx, also a licensed copy of a British Armstrong Siddeley engine, rated at 200 horsepower. Presumably, the less powerful engine was chosen to create an inexpensive trainer aircraft for preparing pilots for the CR20 fighter, but the CR2 also remained a single prototype. Finally, in the early 1930s, several CR1 aircraft were modernized by installing Italian Isata Fraschini Asso Caccia engines with a power output of 440 horsepower, which significantly improved the flight characteristics of the aircraft. The idea of serial production of this new variant was never even considered, since the all-metal CR20 was already in active service, which we will discuss further. The last CR1s equipped with Isata Fraschini engines were retired from the Italian Air Force only in 1937. The Fiat CR1 never took part in combat operations, but this aircraft earned its place in the history of world aviation as the first mass-produced land-based fighter of Italian design and manufacture. The Fiat CR20 fighter became the second aircraft designed by Celestino Rosatelli to be built in large series, and even saw combat service, though not with its native Italian Air Force and not even in the northern hemisphere of our planet. This small, elegant, all-metal aircraft, which was quite a rare phenomenon at the time, made its first flight on July 19, 1926. By layout, it was a sesquiplane. Its upper wing had a noticeably greater span than the lower one. The rigidity of the biplane structure was ensured by the well-proven Warren truss in a W shape made of tubes with a teardrop cross-section, already tested on the CR1. All lifting and control surfaces, the rear fuselage and the fin, were fabric covered, while the forward fuselage up to the rear cockpit bulkhead was metal. Like its predecessor, the CR10, the aircraft was powered by a Fiat A20 inline liquid-cooled engine with 410 horsepower, which drove a 2-bladed fixed-pitch wooden propeller. The basic armament consisted of 2 synchronized 0.303-inch machine guns mounted under the cowling, with the option to install 2 additional guns on the sides of the fuselage. A distinctive feature of the new aircraft was the internal fuel tank, which could be jettisoned in flight in case of fire. At the end of September that same year, the fighter prototype was presented for official trials in Monticello near Turin, conducted by Fiat test pilot Bottala. The aircraft demonstrated ease and simplicity of handling, easily performed all aerobatic maneuvers, turns, loops, rolls, Immelmans, and reached a maximum speed of 174 miles per hour. It fully met the requirements of the time, was promptly adopted for service, entered serial production in 1927, and by the end of the 1920s became the main fighter type of the Regia Aeronautica. Shortly after the start of CR20 production, the company's designers developed a 2-seat trainer variant, the CR20B. The instructor's cockpit was placed behind the main one. Due to the increased weight, the aircraft's performance decreased somewhat. The maximum speed dropped to 155 miles per hour, and service ceiling was reduced by 1,640 feet. However, for a training aircraft, this was not critical, and the CR20B was also produced in series. The CR20 Hydro seaplane fighter with a float undercarriage, which appeared in 1928, proved not very successful. It was nearly 440 pounds heavier than the land-based version. Its drag increased significantly, causing maximum speed to fall to 158 miles per hour, and handling worsened. Nevertheless, 46 CR20 Hydro aircraft were delivered for the needs of the Italian naval aviation. A year later, a new variant called the CR20 bis made its first flight. Compared with the basic 20, it had a reduced wing area, a new undercarriage with separate struts equipped with brakes and oleo-pneumatic shock absorbers, and several other minor changes. Surprisingly, the reduced wing area did not result in the expected speed increase. Nevertheless, the CR20 bis was also produced in series. In 1929, another version appeared, the CR20AQ, identical to the BAS, except for the power plant, It was fitted with a Fiat A25AQ high-altitude engine with 425 horsepower. Apparently, the additional 22 pounds of weight neutralized the power increase, so its performance was about the same as the CR20 bis. Besides the Fiat Aviation plant in Turin, the CR20 was also produced at the Aeronautica Gabardini works in Cameri. In 1932, local engineers there created their own version, designated CR20 Asso. Essentially, it was the same fighter, but with a redesigned forward fuselage, housing a more powerful Isata Frescini Asso Caccia engine of 440 horsepower. However, the increased weight completely offset the added power, so the maximum speed of the Cameri-built version did not exceed that of the standard CR20. In total, 250 aircraft of various CR20 versions and 204 aircraft of the CR20 Asso modification were built. In the Italian Air Force, the Regia Aeronautica, the CR20 and its variants formed the backbone of fighter aviation for nearly 10 years, until they were replaced in the mid-1930s by the famous CR32, created by the same designer Rosatelli. As training aircraft, the 20s continued to serve in the Italian Air Force until 1938-1939. Several CR-20s were also used in the Spanish Civil War as training aircraft within the Italian Expeditionary Air Forces that fought on the side of the nationalists. The CR-20 also had a rather impressive export record for its time. It entered service with the air forces of Lithuania, Austria, Hungary, and Paraguay, and was also purchased for evaluation by the Soviet Union. The first foreign users of the 20 were the Lithuanian Air Force, which received 15 fighters in 1928. Baltic pilots highly appreciated the Italian aircraft for its excellent flight performance and operational reliability. These Fiats remained in Lithuanian Air Force service until the country was incorporated into the Soviet Union in the autumn of 1940, after which they were deemed completely obsolete and sent for scrapping. After the defeat in the First World War, Austria was forbidden by the Treaty of Versailles to have its own military aviation. Only in the early 1930s did the Austrians begin to restore their once powerful air force, at first purchasing outdated aircraft abroad. In 1931-1933, they acquired a batch of fighters withdrawn from the Regia Aeronautica, 32 aircraft of various modifications and 4 two-seat training versions. After the annexation of Austria by Nazi Germany on March 12, 1938, these hopelessly outdated aircraft briefly entered the Luftwaffe as training machines. Hungary, which as part of the former Austro-Hungarian Empire was also prohibited from having its own military aviation, bought 1 single-seat and 1 two-seat CR-20 in 1930, and the following year another 12 aircraft. They remained in service with the Hungarian Air Force until 1936, after which all were transferred to training units. The CR-20 could very well have entered service with the Red Army Air Force. In the USSR, interest in this aircraft appeared even before it was introduced into serial production in Italy, in mid-1926. In November, the Soviet trade mission in Rome began negotiations with the Fiat concern for the supply of the new aircraft to the Union. At the end of 1927, 2 CR-20s were included in the import purchase plan for the following year. In the absence of successful domestic designs, the Soviet leadership considered purchasing a license abroad for the production of fighters. Among the candidates were the German Heinkel, the Czechoslovak Avia, and the Italian CR-20. To make a choice, it was decided to purchase samples of each machine and study them carefully. According to the agreement, the Italians undertook to build, test fly, and deliver 2 fighters complete with engines, propellers, and weapon synchronizers, but without machine guns, as well as a set of special tools for aircraft maintenance. All this cost the Soviet treasury $30,566.40, of which 1/3 was paid to the supplier in advance. The first aircraft was completed at the end of April 1928. On May 15th, Botala flew it for the first time at Monticello. The test flights were observed by a Soviet commission headed by engineer Weitzer. The aircraft was tested with ballast to compensate for the weight of the missing machine guns and radio equipment. The flight data shown at the beginning of the trials turned out to be lower than those declared by the company, and the fighter was returned for modification. It was readjusted and the engine was overhauled, with pistons replaced. After this, flights resumed, and the first Soviet 20 successfully passed acceptance. Soon, the second machine was also prepared. The fighters differed somewhat from each other. On one, the main fuel tank was jettisonable, while on the other, both tanks were covered externally with protective plating. The aircraft with the jettisonable tank had an engine with a lower compression ratio and a slightly smaller fuel supply, making it 44 pounds lighter. After the tests, the aircraft were disassembled, packed into crates, and on May 25th sent by sea to Odessa, and from there by train to Moscow. In July, they arrived at the Central Airfield. To assist in the assembly of the aircraft and training of pilots, Bottala and mechanic Ramello were dispatched from Italy. At the end of July, having completed their task, they returned home. Immediately after assembly, both CR20s were submitted for state testing at the Air Force Research Institute. Flights were carried out by pilots Kozlov, Kudryavtsev, and Sporatov. The evaluation of the Italian fighter given by these pilots turned out to be rather low. The main shortcomings of the Italian fighter were considered insufficient maneuverability, low climb rate, and limited ceiling. When the pilot released the control stick, the aircraft lost stability, and during a dive, it tended to pull its nose downward. All the performance figures obtained at the Soviet Air Force Research Institute proved worse than those claimed by the manufacturer. Thus, the first tested aircraft with protected fuel tanks showed a speed near the ground of 160 miles per hour instead of the promised 168 miles per hour, and reached an altitude of 16,400 feet in 16.2 minutes, instead of the claimed 15.15 minutes. Comparison with Soviet fighters showed that the Soviet 4 surpassed the foreign machine in everything except maximum speed, while having nearly twice the flight range, and the heavier Soviet biplane significantly lagged behind the Italian Fiat in all respects. The rivals of the Italian fighter in training air battles were the rather old British Martinsyde fighter, created back in 1918, as well as two-seat Soviet reconnaissance planes and a training aircraft with an engine of only 300 horsepower, also not the most modern airplanes. Nevertheless, the pilot of the British Martinsyde, despite nearly a 10-year age difference, won a maneuvering battle against the Italian, which did not show decisive superiority even over the larger and heavier two-seat opponents. The pilots sharply criticized the visibility from the cockpit of the Italian fighter. It turned out that the pilot could not see normally in any direction. Downward view was blocked by the wide wing, forward view was obstructed by cockpit struts, and the wide framing of the windscreen, sideways by the wide struts between the wings, and upward by the upper wing. The cockpit was very hot. During takeoff and landing, the aircraft shook heavily due to landing gear shock absorbers too stiff for the imperfect Soviet airfields. At the same time, positive qualities of the Italian Fiat were noted. Smooth execution of aerobatic maneuvers, stability in turns, and ease of control during takeoff and landing. Overall, as a result of the tests, it became clear that the Italian fighter was unsuitable as a combat aircraft and was more appropriate in the role of a training plane. In fact, the main conclusion of the report by the Soviet Air Force Research Institute sounded as follows: this aircraft cannot be recognized as a modern fighter. The Italian aircraft also received an unflattering evaluation from the engineers of the Soviet Institute. From a structural point of view, the aircraft holds no interest, since neither its design nor the connections of its components show anything particularly original. The power plant caused many complaints. Opening the engine cowling was a complicated and lengthy process. A complete oil drain was not provided for. In Italy, unlike most of Russia, severe frosts do not occur. And the fuel tank had no water trap. The engine start procedure was considered primitive and dangerous. Since the Italian fighter lacked a priming fuel pump and a starting tank, the first portion of gasoline was simply poured into the exhaust pipes and allowed to evaporate slightly. The pipes quickly cracked from frequent temperature fluctuations, fuel seeped through the cracks under the cowling, and as a result ignited. During operation at the Soviet Institute, several flare-ups occurred for this reason, though fires were fortunately avoided. In addition, the Italian engine overheated during taxiing, and pilots had to stop before takeoff. The layout of the instrument panel was considered poor, and Italian instruments were of lower quality compared to English and German ones, which were then being purchased for the Soviet Air Force. As a result of the tests and comparisons, the competition was won by the aircraft of the German company Heinkel, which was launched into licensed production in the USSR. The tests of the Italian fighter ended in July 1928, after which the aircraft entered service with the 17th Fighter Squadron of the 15th Aviation Brigade based in Bryansk. 2 line pilots for the Italian machines underwent a special training program at the Soviet Research Institute. In September of the same year, as part of the 15th Aviation Brigade, the Italian Fiats took part in large-scale maneuvers near Bobruisk, where they practiced various combat missions, escorting bombers, covering ground forces, and intercepting aircraft of the mock enemy. Thus, on a training combat sortie on September 15th, one Italian fighter and 3 Soviet biplanes of the 17th Squadron intercepted a French Breguet reconnaissance plane. The French aircraft was part of a separate group from the Soviet Research Institute participating in the maneuvers, which consisted of foreign machines of various types intended to familiarize the troops. The enemy tried to break away from the interceptors by climbing, but the fighters did not fall behind. 2 Italian fighters lived in the Soviet Union for quite a long time. As of January 1, 1931, they were still in the active composition of the Air Force, 1 serviceable and 1 unserviceable aircraft. One of them flew until mid-1931. The last purchase was made in 1933 when 5, according to other sources, 7, fighters of the Italian modification were acquired by South American Paraguay to strengthen its air force in light of growing tensions with neighboring Bolivia and the approaching war. The biography of these machines turned out to be perhaps the most interesting among all the produced 20s. In April 1933, all the ordered aircraft arrived in Asunción. After assembly and test flights, the fighters entered the newly formed 11th Fighter Squadron Los Indios, the Indians. In accordance with the unit's name, the aircraft were marked with the image of an Indian drawing a bow and serial numbers. 9 pilots for the new fighters were transferred from the 1st Squadron of the Paraguayan Air Force. Incidentally, one of these pilots had Russian or Ukrainian origin. His name was Vladimir Porfinenko. The mastering of the Italian Fiat aircraft took place at Campo Grande airfield already under conditions of war, which had begun with Bolivia over the Chaco border region. Training was carried out at an accelerated pace, and on May 26 the fighters flew to the forward airfield of Isla Poy. The transfer went extremely poorly. Only 3 aircraft reached their destination. 1 crashed during the ferry flight. Its pilot, the Englishman Walter Ginn, was unharmed, and the 5th returned shortly after takeoff due to engine malfunctions. Thus, the combat strength of the Indians, as these aircraft were called, was nearly halved without any enemy involvement. The first combat contact of the new squadron with enemy aviation took place on June 11th. A flight of 4 2-seat Curtiss Osprey biplanes of the Bolivian Air Force attempted to attack Isla Poy airfield. Paraguayan fighters scrambled to intercept and drove the enemy aircraft away. 3 Bolivian Hawk fighters then arrived to support the bombers. 1 pilot of the Italian fighters successfully maneuvered into the tail of an enemy aircraft, but at the decisive moment the Fiat's guns jammed. On the same day, the aforementioned Englishman Ginn shot down a Bolivian 2-seat reconnaissance plane, and the next day the Fiat suffered their only combat loss. In an air battle against numerically superior enemy fighters, 1 Italian aircraft was shot down. Between June and August, 3 Indians, the aircraft that had returned to Campo Grande during the ferry flight to the front, was repaired and transferred to Isla Poy, primarily carried out missions escorting reconnaissance and strike aircraft. Encounters with Bolivian aviation were rare and usually ended in a draw. The intensity of ground operations was also low. On March 4, 1934, 1 fighter crashed in an accident. On September 23 of the same year, 2 Paraguayan fighters escorted a lone French Potez 25 reconnaissance plane on a photographic mission and encountered 5 Bolivian Ospreys carrying bombs. The Fiats engaged in battle, and although they failed to shoot down a single enemy aircraft, they still achieved success. Evading Paraguayan attacks, 2 Ospreys collided with each other. On June 12, 1935, the Chaco War ended with Paraguay's victory. On August 20th, this event was celebrated with a ceremonial military parade in the country's capital. 2 Fiats that had survived the war also took part in it. Soon after, these aircraft were transferred to the 1st Squadron at Campo Grande airfield. On October 19, 1939, one of them was lost in a crash. The last Paraguayan-Italian fighter was written off and scrapped 2 years later. In total, the Fiat concern built more than 6,000 aircraft of various types, designed under the leadership of Celestino Rosatelli. In 1931, the company established a second design bureau headed by Giuseppe Gabrielli, whose first production aircraft was the G-50 fighter. But that is already a completely different story.